The dirt hadn't even settled on my husband's grave when my mother-in-law pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. I thought it was a prayer card, or maybe a phone number, a grief counselor, a pastor, someone she wanted me to call. My fingers were so cold I could barely feel the paper between them. It had been snowing since morning, one of those heavy March snowfalls that comes late in the season and feels almost cruel, and I'd been standing at that graveside for so long that my feet had gone numb inside my boots. I unfolded the paper. It was an address, and tucked behind it, $500 bills. "You need to take care of that situation," my mother-in-law said. She nodded once toward my stomach. I was 7 months pregnant. I think I said something. I don't remember what. The wind was loud and the pastor was still talking somewhere behind us, and I just stood there looking at $500 and an address I didn't recognize, trying to understand what was happening. My husband's name was Patrick. He died 11 days before that, on a Tuesday afternoon in a construction accident 2 states away. A beam gave way on a job site. His foreman called me at 2014 in the afternoon, and I remember exactly where I was standing, in the kitchen, putting away groceries, holding a box of pasta, because I dropped it and the pasta scattered across the floor and I never picked it up. It was still there when I got home from the hospital 3 days later. Patrick and I had been married for 4 years. We'd been trying for a baby for almost 2 of them. When I finally got pregnant, we celebrated with takeout Thai food and a card game, and Patrick crying a little. Just a little, in the way he always pretended he wasn't. He was so happy. We were so happy. And then he was gone, and I was 7 months along, and my mother-in-law was handing me money at his funeral and telling me to take care of it. I didn't go to the clinic. I want to be clear about that. Whatever else happened in the months that followed, I never once considered it. Not really. Not for more than the few terrible minutes when the grief and the fear and the cold all crashed together, and I couldn't see anything clearly. I put the money and the address in my coat pocket, and I got through the rest of the funeral, and I told myself I would deal with it later. I didn't know then what dealing with it was actually going to look like. Patrick and I had been renting a house on the east side of Columbus, a small place, 2 bedrooms, nothing fancy, but ours. The lease was in both our names. I'd been working as a dental hygienist up until my 8th month, when my doctor told me to cut back my hours. Patrick's income as a construction foreman had been covering most of our expenses while I worked part-time. We were careful with money. We had savings. Not a lot, but some. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to know, was that my mother-in-law had been a co-signer on our lease. Patrick had asked her to co-sign 2 years earlier, before he got the foreman promotion, when our credit wasn't quite strong enough on its own. He'd mentioned it once, briefly, and I'd said fine, I trusted him to handle it, and then I forgot about it completely, because that's the kind of thing you forget when everything is going smoothly. My mother-in-law did not forget. 3 days after the funeral, she came to the house with a locksmith. I was inside when I heard the knock. I thought it was a neighbor. People had been bringing food, casseroles, and muffins and things I couldn't eat, so I opened the door in my sweatpants, my hair a mess, and there she was with a man carrying a toolbox. "You need to find somewhere else to stay," she said. "I'm taking over the lease." Patrick would have wanted me to have the house. I actually laughed. I thought she was joking. "I live here," I said. "You have 30 days. She handed me a piece of paper, a formal notice, typed up, with her signature on it. "I've already spoken with the landlord. Since I'm on the lease and Patrick is gone, the landlord has agreed to transfer it to my name. You're welcome to take your personal belongings." The locksmith was already looking at the door handle. I shut the door in both their faces and called a lawyer. That phone call saved me. Or rather, it started the chain of things that eventually saved me, though I didn't know it at the time. I found the number through my work's employee assistance program, which I hadn't even known we had until a coworker texted me the information the week after Patrick died. I spoke to a woman named, she asked me to call her Ms. T. She had a voice like someone who had heard everything and was not surprised by any of it. She explained some things to me that afternoon. Important things. Patrick had a life insurance policy through his employer. I was the named beneficiary. My mother-in-law had no claim to it whatsoever. Patrick's death on the job site almost certainly qualified for workers' compensation. His employer's insurance would owe me a settlement. This was not optional. This was law. The house was more complicated because of the co-signing situation, but my mother-in-law could not legally remove me from the premises without a court eviction process. What she had handed me was not a legal eviction notice. It was a piece of paper she typed herself and printed at home. "Don't leave that house," Miss T said. "Not until you've spoken to a housing attorney. Are you safe there right now?" I said I thought so. "Good. I'm going to give you some referrals." I stayed in the house. My mother-in-law called me 4 times that evening. I didn't answer. The next morning she showed up again, this time without the locksmith, but with my father-in-law, and they stood on the porch for 20 minutes while I sat in the kitchen and watched the clock. Eventually they left. That was the last time I saw them for a while. I want to tell you that I was strong through all of this. I want to tell you I handled it with grace and clarity. But the truth is that most of those weeks are a blur of crying and sleeping and eating crackers, because nothing else sounded good, and lying in bed at night with my hand on my stomach, talking to the baby because there was nobody else to talk to. My own family was in Arizona. My closest friends were scattered. I was 7, then 8 months pregnant, in a house that might not be mine much longer, in a city that suddenly felt enormous and empty. The one person I talked to consistently was my neighbor, a woman in her 60s who'd lived next door since before Patrick and I moved in. She'd brought me a pot of soup the day after the funeral and then just kept checking in, knocking on the door, leaving things on the porch, asking if I needed anything. I started leaving the door unlocked so she could let herself in when I didn't answer. She had a key by week 3. She was the one who drove me to my prenatal appointment in early April, when I was 36 weeks along and hadn't been sleeping and my blood pressure was higher than my doctor wanted it. The appointment was at a clinic about 20 minutes from the house, my regular OB's practice. I'd been going there since my first trimester. My doctor's name was Dr. Ewan, a small, quiet woman who spoke precisely and never wasted a word, and who I trusted completely. That afternoon, after she reviewed my numbers, she sat down across from me and said, "I need you to be honest with me about how you're doing, not physically. How are you actually doing?" I started crying before I could even answer. I told her everything: the funeral, the piece of paper, the money, the locksmith, the phone calls, the nights alone, the crackers, the conversations with the baby. Dr. Ewan listened without interrupting. When I finished, she handed me a box of tissues and was quiet for a moment. "You're dealing with an enormous amount," she said, "and your body is showing the strain of it. Your blood pressure concerns me, and stress is a significant contributing factor." She paused. "I also want to say, and I'm saying this as your physician, not as anyone trying to interfere in your personal situation. What your mother-in-law asked you to do at the funeral was not a medical recommendation. It was not medically indicated in any way. You are 7 months pregnant with a healthy baby, and there is no clinical reason to end this pregnancy. None. I want you to hear that clearly." I nodded. I already knew it, but there was something about hearing it said plainly in a medical office by a doctor I trusted that made it land differently. "What I'd like to do," she continued, "is connect you with our social work team. We have a patient advocate on staff who specifically works with patients navigating difficult family situations. She can help you identify resources, legal, financial, housing. You shouldn't be trying to figure all of this out alone." I met the patient advocate the following week. Her name was Lorraine, and she was the kind of person who makes you feel, within 5 minutes of meeting her, that things are going to be okay. Not in a false way, in a practical way. She had a list. She always had a list. She connected me with a housing attorney who reviewed my situation and confirmed what Miss T had told me. My mother-in-law did not have grounds to remove me from the property without going through formal eviction proceedings, which would take time and which I had every right to contest. Given that I was about to give birth, any judge was going to look very carefully at those proceedings. She connected me with Patrick's HR department at the construction company, where I learned that the life insurance policy was $180,000. $180,000. I had not known the amount, Patrick had handled that when he started the job, and we'd never specifically talked about the number. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the insurance office for a long time after that appointment. She also connected me with a workers' compensation attorney, a man named, I'll call him my attorney, who told me very calmly that based on what he knew about the site conditions and the circumstances of Patrick's death, we had a strong case. Strong turned out to be an understatement. 8 months later, after everything was settled, I understood what he meant. My mother-in-law filed for formal eviction in May. By that point, I had legal representation and had filed my own counter notice disputing her claim to the lease. The eviction process stalled. Her attorney sent letters. My attorney responded to the letters. I stopped answering the door when she knocked and started communicating exclusively through legal channels, which my attorney told me was exactly the right thing to do. I gave birth on May 19th, 11 days after my due date, after 14 hours of labor and one very long epidural. My neighbor was with me for the whole thing. She held my hand during the hardest contractions and talked to me about her garden, what she was planting, what had come up already, whether the tomatoes would do better this year than last. It was exactly the right thing to talk about. My daughter was 7 pounds 4 ounces. I named her Rosalie. Patrick's middle name, his mother's maiden name, which he'd carried as a middle name, was Rose. I was not naming her after my mother-in-law. I was naming her after Patrick. When I held Rosalie for the first time and she looked up at me with those dark, unfocused, newborn eyes, I said out loud, just to her, just quietly, "Your dad would have thought you were the most amazing thing he'd ever seen." And I believed it. I still believe it. The hospital stay was 3 days. My neighbor drove us home and stayed for the first week, sleeping on the couch, getting up for the 3 a.m. feeds so I could sleep between attempts to nurse. I don't know how I would have survived that first week without her. The eviction case was dismissed in June. The judge reviewed the circumstances, the co-signing arrangement, the lease terms, the fact that I was the surviving spouse with a newborn, and found that my mother-in-law's claim did not meet the legal standard for eviction. She was furious. Her attorney sent a letter suggesting we might want to consider a voluntary arrangement, in which I agreed to vacate within 60 days in exchange for her dropping any future claims. I did not take the arrangement. What I did instead, once Rosalie was 6 weeks old and I'd had time to think clearly for the first time in months, was sit down with my attorney and Lorraine and figure out what I actually wanted. Not what I was afraid of. Not what I was afraid of. Not what I was reacting to. What I wanted. I wanted to stay in Columbus. Rosalie's pediatrician was here. Dr. Ewan was here. My neighbor was here. I wanted to go back to work, part-time at first. My practice had held my position. I wanted to buy the house. That last one surprised me when I said it out loud. But the more I thought about it, the more right it felt. Patrick and I had built our life in that house. Rosalie was going to come home from the hospital to that house. My mother-in-law did not get to take it from us. The landlord, as it turned out, was tired of the whole situation. He'd been receiving letters from 2 different sets of attorneys for 4 months, and he wanted out. When my attorney approached him about a potential sale, he was receptive almost immediately. We negotiated a price. With the life insurance settlement as a down payment, I qualified for a mortgage on my own. I closed on the house in September. My mother-in-law did not speak to me again for a long time after that. She sent one letter, through her attorney, expressing her view that I had behaved dishonorably and that Patrick would have been disappointed in me. I read it twice, put it in a folder, and went to make dinner. I think about Patrick every day. I talk to Rosalie about him, who he was, what he loved, the way he laughed, how seriously he took his fantasy football league even though he was terrible at it. There are pictures of him in every room. She's going to grow up knowing her father. What I also think about, sometimes not with anger, just with a kind of clear-eyed recognition, is how different it could have been. If I hadn't had that employee assistance number. If I hadn't called Miss T. If Dr. Ewan hadn't asked me, plainly and directly, how I was actually doing. If Lorraine hadn't had her list. There's a version of this story where a woman who is 7 months pregnant and freshly widowed and handed $500 at a graveside believes she has no options. I understand how you get to that version. I was close to it more than once, but I want anyone in that version, anyone who's reading this or hearing this and recognizes something of themselves in it, to know that the options exist even when you can't see them. Call the employee assistance line. Call the hospital social worker. Call the OB and answer honestly when she asks how you're doing. The list exists. Someone has it. Rosalie is 16 months old now. She has Patrick's nose and my stubbornness and an opinion about everything, expressed loudly and without ambiguity. She is, genuinely, the funniest person I know. We're doing okay, more than okay, we're home.